Hello again from Metro Manila, the Philippines, Southeastern Asia. I want to address in this hopefully brief video the controversy about who actually was asked if she believed in God and answered yes during the Columbine High School shooting over 19 years ago on April the 20th, 1999. As late as in September 2015, during an early Republican presidential candidate debate, one candidate, the former Senator Rick Santorum, referred to Cassie Bernall, one of the deceased victims of the shooting, as a hero, and claimed that her murderer, had challenged her about her faith, and she had refused to deny God. There is controversy because, according to Emily Wyant, another female student who was hiding under the same table with Cassie, the latter was praying and had first asked, said, oh God, why is this happening? I just want to go home. And had then prayed very quietly. Then Eric Harris, her murderer, had either said or shouted, peekaboo! And then had killed her at point blank range. The bullet wound indicating that actually the gun's muzzle was touching Cassie's head. Some survivors of that shooting rampage in the library believed that Cassie indeed was asked by her murderer just before being shot and killed if she believed in God, and she had said in a strong, firm voice, yes. However, others have disputed this and believe that instead Valine Schnurr, the survivor of the shooting, had, after first being shot, pleaded God to let her live, and then Dylan Klebold, who apparently had shot her, had asked her if she believed in God. She had replied yes. Dylan had asked why. Valine had replied, because I believe, and my parents have taught me to believe. And then Dylan had asked why, possibly again, or had just walked away. And the critics of this alleged myth of Cassie Bernall as a martyr, well, Cassie definitely was a Christian. She had become a Christian during a Christian weekend retreat for the young people in March 1997, aged 15. Before that, she had dabbled in the occult for some years, had even symbolically given her soul to Satan through one of her friends, but had then been evangelized since January 1997 by Jamie, a very kind and merciful, loving, caring, and patient Christian girl at a Christian school. And Jamie had actually written a letter to Cassie's parents, Brad and Misty Bernall, begging them to let Cassie attend that weekend retreat. It was a big surprise even for Jamie that during that weekend Cassie surrendered her life to Jesus Christ in a tearful prayer and confession outside the building where the youth services were being held that weekend. Even Misty Bernall, in her biography of Cassie, um, warned people not to idolize her, not to turn her into another Joan of Arc, named after that early 15th century French peasant girl or young woman who claimed to have heard God's voice, or voices of angels or saints, possibly, telling her to rise up in order to liberate France from the English soldiers. And of course it is possible, when something as tragic as the Columbine High School massacre happens, and when at least a few or some of the victims happen to be professing godly Christians, to overemphasize their lives and testimonies instead of giving all the glory to God. And maybe this has been one case, although I still believe that much, if not most, of the Christian attention focused on Cassie and her firmness of faith, even in the final moments of her life, even if she was not asked if she believed in God. The fact that she died while praying quietly, I would want to believe that it is genuine, or has been genuine. But then, of course, some people have blown things out of proportion. According to a journalist of Dave Cullen, who wrote a critical article about Cassie Bernall entitled "Why Does the Columbine Myth About Martyr Cassie Bernall Persist?", which was published on the New Republic's website. The New Republic is an American, at least Republican-leaning magazine. It was published on September the 17th, 2015. He said, and I quote selectively, "Cassie rallies with fevered altar calls erupted around the globe. The biggest occurred at the Silver Dome in Michigan, where Weekly Standard writer Joseph Bottom described how 73,000 teenagers wept along with sermon after sermon on her death." And then he wrote, "All the while detectives and FBI agents leading the massive police investigation fretted over, in other words, worried over how to break it to the public that it was all a huge misunderstanding. Emily Wyant, the little girl under the table with Cassie when it happened, came forward. Virtually every major media organization followed. Like most of the Columbine myths, the martyr story gained traction because it was based on a kernel of truth. The young girl did profess her faith in God at gunpoint, but she lived to tell about it. Her name is Valine Schnurr. 10 years later, I sorted through the confusion again in my book Columbine. Val was shot before her exchange about God. Dylan pointed his shotgun under the table and fired several rapid bursts, killing Lauren Townsend and injuring Val and another girl. Val was riddled with shotgun pellets up and down her arms and torso. Dylan walked away. Val dropped to her knees, then her hands. Blood was streaming out of 34 separate wounds. Oh my God, don't let me die," she prayed. Dylan turned around. This was too rich. God? Do you believe in God? Well, Dylan had been raised in the Lutheran Church, but he definitely was not a believer. She wavered. Maybe she should keep her mouth shut. No, she would rather say it. Yes, I believe in God. Why? Because I believe, and my parents brought me up that way. Dylan reloaded, but something distracted him. He walked off. Val crawled for shelter. Craig Scott, incidentally, Rachel Scott's brother, and Rachel was the first recorded deceased victim of the shooting spree. Hiding under a table in the middle of the library, heard the exchange and for some reason thought it was Cassie. And he was able to escape the library with a few of other students. He told friends and the story took off. And then by Sunday, April the 25th, just 5 days after the shooting, it was being reported by major media and proclaimed from pulpits around the world, or especially around the United States and Canada. And according to Emily Wyant, a survivor of the shooting, Cassie had asked, dear God, why is this happening? I just want to go home." "I know," Emily answered. They both were whispering. "We all want to get out of here." Between exchanges, Cassie prayed very quietly. Eric and Dylan passed by several times, but Emily never expected one of them to come under the table and shoot. However, Eric stopped at their table at Cassie's end. Emily could see his legs and his boots pointing directly at the right side of Cassie's face. Cassie didn't turn. Emily didn't have to. She was facing perpendicular to Eric's stance, so she could look straight at Cassie and see Eric just to her left at the same time. Eric slammed his hand on the table, then squatted halfway down for a look. "Peekaboo," he said. And then Eric poked his shotgun under the table rim as he came down. He didn't pause long, or even stop down far enough for Emily to see his face. She saw the sawed-off gun barrel. The opening was huge. She looked into Cassie's brown eyes. Cassie was still praying. There was no time for words between them. Eric shot Cassie in the head. And since the blast happened just centimeters, definitely less than 1 meter from Emily, it temporarily blew out most of Emily's hearing. The fire alarm had been unbearably loud, but now she could barely hear it. Cassie's church, the West Bowl Community Church, an apparently non-denominational church in Littleton, in or around Littleton, Colorado, didn't back down from its story. Hannah Rosin wrote an article for Washington Post, published on October the 14th, 1999, and she found out that the church wasn't backing down. She interviewed Valine Schnurr, who at the time didn't want to be known as the girl who really said yes, or the living saint, or the almost martyr, although she was all those things. And she definitely didn't want to be known as the girl who punctured the myth of Cassie Bernal, although by no means alone. And indeed, several months after, or some months after the shooting, was it Darren Scott, anyway, Rachel Scott's father, who in a video recorded informal sermon or speech, at least parts of which have been uploaded on YouTube, said that, and he was relying on Rick Castaldo's testimony. Castaldo was eating lunch with Rachel on the grass near the school. Unlike Rachel, he did survive. That before shooting her, Eric Harris would have asked Rachel Scott if she believed in God, and then would have shot her fatally. That simple, defiant yes stirred the collective teenage soul. Finally, young Christians had a saint they could touch. A less than average high school junior laid bare in a new best-selling book by her grieving parents, titled plainly, She Said Yes. Her peers made her a saint who died to redeem them. She made them the yes generation. Recreating events of that day, investigators discovered weeks after the shooting what they weren't looking for and never wanted to find: and what they will now reluctantly admit. Cassie probably never said yes or anything else. However, she had said yes over 2 years earlier to the call of Jesus Christ, offering her salvation, and she was saved at the time of her death. Sorry. If the truth had been known early on that actually Cassie wasn't asked that question, probably, but Valine was. The legend could have been different. It could have been told that a fearless girl, crouched and bleeding, spoke the name of Jesus and lived. That she summoned God to shield her from Satan's henchmen. But the truth wasn't known. And now that it is, it barely reverberates. Even so, why does it matter? In questions of death and faith, it's the power of the story that counts. Well, it may well be that Miss or Ms. or Mrs. Rosen is not a professing Christian. I don't know. The tale that helps the mind grasp the unfathomable. And then she skeptically wrote, compared with that comfort, the truth is a trifle, but this is by no means always the case. Should the believers accept the literal truth, they'd be left with a hopeless equation. Schnurr said yes and she lived, but saints and martyrs don't live. Then again, we have to take into account the fact that according to the Bible, which the Christians believe in, those who are true believers will live forever. And then their bodies, of course, they will physically die if they are not among those who, according to many evangelicals, Pentecostals and charismatics, will be caught up or translated without physical death at Jesus Christ's second coming. But those who die the natural way will then have resurrection bodies, put on resurrection bodies and rise from their graves even if they hadn't been properly buried at Jesus Christ's second coming. And then those who are alive and are ready spiritually for his return will suddenly receive resurrection bodies without physical death. But let's get back. Saint Cassie probably said nothing and died. However, she was praying with her friend Emily. Schnurr is devout enough to know that faith doesn't depend on the details, that if Cassie's example brings teenagers to Christ, that's what's important. Plus, Schnurr came out with her life, and right now the mundane details of an average day are miracle enough. The last thing I want is for someone to call me a hero, she says. I don't want to be famous or get any title. I just want to live my life and be me. Even in easier times, Val Schnurr is the type to dodge attention. She isn't shy, she says, only self-contained and media unfriendly. Ask if she'd consider writing a book, and she balks. I'm pretty uncomfortable with publicity, she says, speaking by phone from her parents' home, where she's spending the weekend. I don't really like things that draw more attention to me. As a freshman, then she was a freshman at the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, about an hour and a half north of Littleton. She is trying hard to establish a routine and is almost succeeding. Flashbacks come ever so often. One hit the previous month, so in September 1999, when a fire alarm went off in the dorm. And then there's her ever-present reminder, the purplish scars on her arms. I can't look at those every day and say, gee, where did those come from? She says, the physical wounds are constant memory. Schnurr, who was raised a Catholic, occasionally speaks at evangelical youth rallies. At these events, the teens will recall their bloody encounter, sometimes in spiritual terms, and their struggle to overcome it. Most are received with tears and applause. Schnurr gets a dose of suspicion. Once she told her story at a youth rally honoring Cassie and Rachel Scott, another born-again Christian teen who was shot and killed. And Schnurr says she could feel people looking at her in a funny way. No one really comes out and says that never happened. They just skirt around the issue, like they ask, "Are you sure that's how it happened?" Or, "Could your faith really be that strong?" she says. "People thought I was a copycat," she recalls. And you know it gets frustrating, because you know in your heart where you were and what you said, and then people doubt you. Schnurr's story is the same one she's been telling since she came out of anesthesia after her first surgery to remove the 34 pellets that pierced her arms and torso. When she admitted that she believes in God because she believes, and her parents had brought her up that way, when Dylan Klebold had asked, and then had crawled away while Dylan was reloading, and he didn't shoot at her again. It didn't really cross her mind that something bad would happen to her because she had answered. Dylan asked, and she couldn't say no. And she didn't think of it as bravery. She thought of it as what she had said because it was true, because it just was her life, her character. What else was she going to say? Valerie Schnurr's parents turned fiercely protective. Her mother, Sherry, said, "She has a beautiful story." Then to have people question it to her face, well, that will shock anyone. Why shouldn't she be able to tell her story without anyone second-guessing her, putting her on trial, cross-examining her? And the announcement of the Bernals book made things even more tense, because the Schnurrs had been meeting with investigators, poring over the tapes of the 911 calls and transcripts from witnesses, and knew what the investigators had concluded about Cassie's story. And they also knew the investigators had already told the Bernals. One Sunday night in June 1999, the Bernals and the Schnurrs met, them and their publisher Chris Zimmerman. The Bernals said they wanted to write a book mostly about Cassie's remarkable transformation from a teen obsessed with death rock, vampires, and self-mutilation to a Christian. They asked if they could include a section on Val, and Mrs. Schnurr agreed to a brief mention and nothing more. And after the meeting, no one could feel annoyed with the Bernals. "I felt very sorry for them dealing with losing their daughter," says Mark Schnurr, Valerie's father. "They had so much sadness." Most people have come to terms with the book the way Sherry Schnurr has as Misty's way of healing. The book, already at the time of this article's writing, was climbing the New York Times bestseller list. And then Emily Wyant, who was hiding under the same library table at Columbine High School as Cassie, was mentioned as the source. Ultimately, Zimmerman and the Bernals fall back on their best defense that the book barely discusses the moment of Cassie's death. Get beyond its title, and the book is a raw and moving account of the Bernals' struggle to tame their daughter in the years before she transferred to Columbine, a guidebook for frustrated Christian parents. And Misty Bernal was quoted as saying, "Cassie was our daughter, so it's hard to think of her as a saint or a martyr. We wanted people to know Cassie was an average teenager who struggled with her weight and worried about boys and wasn't even a living saint." To make Cassie a saint would be all too easy, she wrote in the book. It is important to add that the daughter I knew was equally capable of being selfish and stubborn, and that sometimes she behaved like a spoiled 2-year-old. As time has passed, many Christians have come to think of the Cassie story as proof of God's existence. A cover article in the current issue of Christianity Today, an interdenominational evangelical magazine that such American Christian leaders as the late Reverend Billy Graham helped to establish back in 1956, argues that Cassie's heroic yes with the muzzle of a gun pressed up against her is this generation's defining moment, much as the assassination of President Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr. was to the generation before. And Schnurr was wondering what God would have in store for her. There are good days, she says, and of those she feels grimly free. Coming so close to death means you live every day like it's your last, she says. If God wants me, I can be gone in 48 hours or in the next 10 minutes. It comes when it comes. All I can hope is that I'll be ready. What a humble way to end that recorded section of the interview anyway.